Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So Incus virtual machines are pretty much like any other virtual machine that you might create with Proxmox or Hyper-V or VirtualBox. But the primary difference is that Incus virtual machines are created from an image, so they don't have to go through a traditional operating system installation process. So we're going to talk about Incus VMs custom installations. So there are many images included in linuxcontainers.org, and they can be used to create Incus virtual machines. And you can also create Incus containers and virtual machines with your own images that you have published to your local server images, and you can list them with Incus image list. And I believe in previous videos I talked about the fact that you can use the Incus publish command to publish a image of an existing virtual machine or existing Incus container. So you can list available public VM images with the command Incus image list images, don't forget the colon, and then I pipe that to grep virtual, and that way it only lists the virtual machine images and not the containers, and it's really Incus virtual machines that we want to discuss today. So normally you do not have to go through a traditional operating system installation process to create an Incus virtual machine, because you create them with these pre-built images, and that makes them a lot faster. So this tutorial is about how to create Incus virtual machines via a traditional bootable ISO image. Let's begin by listing any images that exist on the local server by doing an Incus image list, and you can see here that there is one image, and it is for an Incus container, and it's the Ubuntu 2204 Jammy image. As a bit of a review, in order to access your images on another Incus server on your network, normally you would do an Incus image list and give the name of the server. So for example, VMS Rain is another one of my servers, and you'd put a colon at the end. And here it says the remote VMS Rain doesn't exist. In order to correct that problem, I'm going to go over to a terminal on VMS Rain, and here I have a terminal on VMS Rain where I'm going to say Incus config trust add VMS cloud -Incus, which is the other server. And then when I do that, it gives me a certificate token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that token. So now back on our original server, VMS Cloud -Incus, I simply do an Incus remote add VMS Rain and then give the address of VMS Rain. I accept the fingerprint with a Y, and then I go ahead and paste in that token that we got over on VMS Rain, and it says that the client certificate is now trusted by VMS Rain. Now that VMS Rain is trusting VMS Cloud -Incus, I can go up here and pick up this previous command that didn't work, the Incus image list VMS Rain. I can copy that and then paste it down here, and when we hit enter, you're going to see that we can list all of the images. I'll make this a little bit smaller so you can see. And so there's the list of images that VMS Rain currently has. Normally, the way that I would create an Incus VM is with a command such as Incus launch images :Ubuntu /22.04, and in this case I'm making it a desktop instance, so /desktop, and I'm going to name the name of the Incus virtual machine desktop, and then --VM means it's actually an Incus VM as opposed to an Incus container, and --console equals VGA means that it's supposed to bring up the remote viewer to show the GUI. And just as a reminder, if we look at the top of the screen where it says Incus image list, you'll notice that we do not currently have an image for Ubuntu Jammy that is a virtual machine. We simply have the container image. So if I hit enter, it will go ahead and work on launching that image, and it's going to do that by retrieving it from images : which is the repository at linuxcontainers.org. Now that the image has been launched, it's going ahead and booting that image, and here we have the remote viewer, and the remote viewer is in the process of showing the boot up for that Ubuntu 2204 desktop image, and shortly it is going to jump into the GUI screen and log into that Incus virtual machine. Now that the Incus virtual machine is up and running, I'm going to go ahead and exit the remote viewer. And now that I've exited the remote viewer, I'm going to go ahead and do an Incus list. And here you can see that I have my desktop image that is up and running. Now we can also do an Incus image list at this point. And the Incus image list now lists the virtual machine image that it had to download in order to create this Incus virtual machine. If you have been following my tutorials on Incus, you've noticed that every time we've done an Incus launch command, we've said images : and that is loading the image from the linuxcontainers.org image repository. So if I do the command Incus image list images : and then I go ahead and pipe that to grep and search for the word virtual in uppercase, it will only list the virtual machine images that are located over on that particular repository, which is the public repository for virtual machines. And if we scroll all the way up the page, we can see here that it has things like Alpine and Rocky and Fedora and OpenSUSE and Ubuntu and really all sorts of other things. And so if your image is listed here, you will be able to create a virtual machine, an Incus virtual machine, using that particular image. So what if there is no image for your Incus virtual machine? What do you do then? And the answer is you can begin by creating a virtual machine that is empty. And you do that with the Incus init, and then I'm naming my virtual machine test VM, and then I have -- empty and then -- VM. So that goes ahead and creates an empty virtual machine. And if I do an Incus list, you'll see that we now have desktop that's running, test that's running, which is a container, but we have test -VM, which is a virtual machine, and init creates it without starting it, whereas launch creates it and starts it. So the next thing that we have to consider is the fact that when you create an Incus virtual machine, the default size of the disk device, the block storage device, is 10 gigabytes, and we might want more than 10 gigabytes. So I use the command incus config device override on the virtual machine test-VM, and the root size of that disk is being redefined as 50 gigabytes. And so now it says device root overwritten for test-VM, and we now have a 50 gigabyte disk. The other thing that we might want to do for our Incus virtual machine is to set some limits. So I'm going to do an incus config set test-VM limits.cpu equals 4. So that means that it can have up to 4 CPU cores when it's under load. And then limits.memory means that it can have up to 4 gigabytes of memory when it is under load. And when I hit enter, you don't see anything back, but it has changed those settings. I've decided that what I would like to do with my Incus virtual machine is to install Zorin OS. And Zorin OS does not have an image over on linuxcontainers.org, but here on the Zorin OS site, I can download an ISO of Zorin OS, which is a popular alternative to Windows and Mac OS for new Linux users. In order to install Zorin OS, I'm going to need to be able to download an ISO bootable image of Zorin OS, and I do that with the wget command, and here it is downloading Zorin OS version 17.1. Now that the Zorin OS image has completed its download, I can go ahead and do an ls-al, and you can see that we have a Zorin OS 17.01 or 17.1-core-64-bit-r1.iso file, which is a bootable ISO for Zorin OS. So now I'm going to go ahead and add a definition to test-vm, and the definition I'm going to add is going to be for something called the install disk. And the word install, I could have called it CD-ROM or anything else I wanted to call it. That was completely arbitrary. But I'm saying Incus config device add what to test-vm and add a device called install. It will be a disk, and the source of that will be in equal to //scott/Zorin-OS, ISO. And it's important to note that you have to have the full pathway to this particular file, and that's why I've listed it out as /home/Scott/Zorin. And then out here at the end of the command, we have boot.priority equals 10. And what that does is it makes the boot priority of the ISO image higher than the boot priority of the internal disk drive, which at this point has no OS installed on it. At this point, all we need to do is start this virtual machine, which should initiate the installation of Zorin OS. And we do that with an Incus start test-vm -console equals VGA, which will launch the remote viewer. And when the remote viewer comes up, we get the Zably splash screen. And then it says, do you want to try or install Zorin OS? I'll go ahead and hit enter. At this point, I'm going to check off install Zorin OS, and it will begin a normal installation. I'll go ahead and blow through this. When we get to the installation type screen, it says that this computer currently has no detected operating systems, and that's because it's looking at the Incus virtual machine virtual disk that we set at 50 gigabytes. So erase the disk and install Zorin OS is the selected option, and I'll go ahead and say install now. And the next screen is just a confirmation that we really want to continue and erase the virtual disk. After the requisite amount of time has passed, we can click Restart Now. And when we click Restart Now, it will go ahead and reboot. So what I'm going to do at this point in time is leave my full screen on the remote viewer and then come over here and abort the remote viewer just with the Control-C. And then I'm going to do an Incus config device remove from the test virtual machine the install disk that we assigned earlier. So now we've got that disk removed. Now I'll restart my remote viewer by doing an Incus console test VM -- type equals VGA, and it comes back up and says, please remove the installation, medium, and then press enter. Of course, we've done that, and now we press enter. And so at that point, it exits out because it's doing the reboot. I'll go ahead and initiate the console command again. It gives you the option here, so I'll go ahead and say continue the boot up process, and it should boot up Zorin OS. Now that I'm at my login screen, I go ahead and click my Scott username and type in my password, and we log in. And here is our Zorin OS desktop. I'm going to go ahead and shut down my Zorin OS Incus virtual machine by clicking the power off button and say power off. It'll go ahead and exit and bring me back to the prompt. At this point, if I do an Incus list, I'll remind you that if we did an Incus image list, we just have the two images from Ubuntu Jammy, one being for the container and one being for the virtual machine. And we don't yet have any images for Zorin OS, and that's because Zorin OS was installed manually. However, we can do the command, now that the container, the virtual machine, is stopped, we can do the command incus publish from test-vm and make the alias something called Zorin17-image. Now that the image of our installed Zorin OS has been published to the image server here, if I do an Incus image list, we can see that it is approximately 6.3 gigabytes in size, and that's as opposed to the virtual machine image for Ubuntu being only 971 megs and a container only being 120 megs. So the reason that the Zorin OS image was 6.3 gigabytes is because it has all of the applications installed. Now that we have our Zorin OS image, if I do an ls of this desktop, I have the ISO image that we used to perform the install, and I no longer need that. So I can do an RM on that image and delete it. And once I do that, then I can do an Incus list. And I can even do a Incus delete on test-vm. And by the way, you can do Incus delete or you can do Incus RM to remove a container. Either one will work. So now, if I do an Incus list, we no longer have that container running out here. And so if we want to create a new container, we can do that because we have the image. And just as a reminder, if we do an Incus image list, here is the Zorin OS image. So let's create a new container based on that Zorin image, and I can do an Incus launch. And normally I would have said images : if I was going to linuxcontainers.org, but in this particular case, I'm just going to say Incus launch the Zorin17-image, and I'm going to call the name of my new container simply Zorin. And I do that, and it says launching Zorin and retrieving the image, and it's retrieving that image from the local image list that is part of my default storage pool. Notice when we launched the image, I didn't have to say --VM, and that's because that particular image was a VM, and so I didn't have to specify that. But now, since the image is up and running in virtue of the Incus launch command, if I do an Incus list, you'll see that it is up and running, and it is called Zorin. So now if I go ahead and say Incus console Zorin -- type equals VGA, it comes up and gives me a login prompt. I did not have to perform any sort of an installation because now we have an image of a fully installed Zorin OS. As one final thought, in addition to being able to publish images, we can export images and then turn around and import them onto other Incus servers where they can be used as well. So in summary, since Incus and LXD virtual machines are normally created from images on linuxcontainers.org, there is generally no need to go through a normal installation process. And this tutorial showed how to create an empty Incus virtual machine and add a bootable ISO image to it in order to install an OS for which there is no image. And once you have installed an Incus VM, you can publish an image to use as a starting point to create additional Incus virtual machines. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.